So welcome to the course or to this training, Crisisonomy and Safety Expert Education and Training in the International Society. The first module of this course is Introduction to Disaster Resilience. I'll be with you. I'm Avelino Flio Jr. I'm the Capacity Development Specialist of Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. You can email me at avelino@adpc.net should you have any questions related to this course, which I hope I could provide answers and give some enlightenment. So to start with, for this module, we have basically three objectives. One is we will review important terms in disaster resilience. So this covers the what of the disaster resilience. It is more about concepts. The next part is we'll discuss the importance of disaster resilience. Why do we need to undertake it? So this is the appreciation process of the module. The third part is we will discuss ways and processes for achieving disaster resilience. This is the how part. So basically, it's the what, the concept part, why, the need to do it. So because if it's important, then we follow the how. If you think it's not important, then no need to proceed to the third. But I'm sure you'll see the importance of disaster resilience. And in terms of approach, it's more of a self-reflection. But in the latter part of the course, there will be a question and answer where I can join you in real time. So feel free, reflect, and then in the coming days, or as I've said in the email, you can always reach me. So let's start with the first objective. Review of important terms in disaster resilience. So I'll just be giving you a few terms. Not much, just few, but you really need to get a solid understanding of it. So for the disaster resilience key terms and concepts, we'll be covering the term disaster, disaster risk, hazards, exposure, vulnerability, capacity, and resilience. So just 7 terms, but please take time to really digest it. So we'll start. If you will look at that picture, those 3 pictures, it happened in your country, in Korea. So flood, roads collapsing, people displaced. So this is basically what you call a disaster, because it is an event that has already occurred and caused massive damage. So disaster is defined as a serious disruption in the functioning of a community or society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts. So I would like to emphasize here the red one, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Therefore, there's a need for immediate external assistance. So that's a disaster. It is an event that has already occurred, and the impacts are losses. Next, disaster risk. When we're talking of disaster risk, or when we're talking of disaster, losses are always equated with disaster. So disaster risk, by definition, is the potential losses in lives, health status, livelihoods, assets, and services which could occur to a particular community or a society over some specified future period of time. So what it means here is that while we cannot quantify loss of lives, but usually it is measured in terms of dollars, or in my country, the Philippines peso, in Thailand baht, in Korea, in terms of won. So disaster risk, which are losses, is in fact an interplay of HVE. I'll give you 5 seconds. Can you recall the HVE? I mentioned earlier and the terms we have to cover. H, V, and E. All right, so I think your time is up. So let's start. First, when we're talking of disaster risk, the HVE is the hazard, vulnerability, exposure, overcapacity. Take note, this is the formula for disaster risk. It's not a mathematical formula, but it's a representation. So disaster risk are potential losses. If you will look at the building when floods happen, what are the potential losses there? Diseases, people getting sick or dying, properties damaged. Losses will occur if there is a hazard. So in that case, the hazard is a flood. So what is a hazard? Hazard is a dangerous or phenomenon, substance, human activity or condition that may, I would like to emphasize here, that may cause loss of lives, livelihoods and services, injury or other health impacts, property or environmental damage, social and economic disruption. So the key word here is that hazard is a potential occurrence of an event. Unlike disaster, it has already occurred. Hazard is a potential of happening. So, these are examples of hazards and classifications. You have geophysical, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. So in the case of Korea, your country, you did experience earthquake. And I think if I'm not mistaken, 2 to 3 years back, you've experienced your strongest earthquake of around 5.8 magnitude. Hydrometeorological, storms, and as a result of storms, there are floods, landslide, and debris flow. And these are the things you commonly experience. And in my country, in the Philippines, where we experience 20 to 24 cyclones per year, it's interesting to note how we cope. And it's also interesting to note that some of the cyclones that we experience, it will go to Korea, Japan, China, and by that time, the intensity has weakened a bit. But you do experience storms, flooding, and landslides. Climatological, you did experience heat waves and cold spells. And the most common you encounter is more technological. Like you had the several experiences of ferry sinking. So those are, things that may happen or has happened. So disaster is you have a hazard and you're vulnerable to it. So there's vulnerability. Vulnerability is defined as the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. Take note that I colored susceptible as red. Susceptible means your proximity, your being close to the effect of that particular hazard. So hazard could be social, economic, environmental, and physical. So just remember the word SEEPC. Vulnerability could be social. It has to do with knowledge, education, understanding, and practices. Economic has to do with your material and financial well-being. That's economic. Environmental has to do with your immediate environment. And physical could be your physical body itself. Do you experience diseases? Are you a person with disabilities? So people have different vulnerability. So you have a hazard, you're vulnerable to it, and you are exposed to it. So exposure is people, properties, systems, or other elements present in a hazardous zone or in hazard zones that are thereby subject to potential losses. So, to make a difference, vulnerability is the why, while exposure is the what. So going back to the equation now, disaster happens, or there are losses when there's a flood or a hazard, and you're vulnerable and you're exposed to it. Okay? Let me repeat. Even if there's a hazard, but you're not vulnerable to it, even if you're exposed, there will be no disaster losses. Or again, even if there's a hazard and you're vulnerable to it, but you're not exposed, so no issue as well. So the last part is capacity. Capacity is the ability of people, organizations, and systems using available resources to face and manage adverse conditions, emergencies, or disasters. So the opposite of capacity is vulnerability. So if vulnerability could be social, economic, environmental, and physical, capacity as well could be classified as social capacity, economic capacity, environmental capacity, and physical capacity. So, in ending, the disaster is made up of 5: disaster risk, hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and capacity. Now take note, capacity and vulnerability and exposure are inversely proportional, which means that if you want to decrease vulnerability and exposure, then you have to improve or increase capacity. And another way of looking at it, the lesser the capacity, the more vulnerable and the more exposure will individuals and communities are. So are we clear in terms of the 7 important terms, or 6, because we haven't touched resilience yet? So disaster, disaster risk, hazard, vulnerability, exposure, capacity. Now we'll be discussing resilience. Now there are many definitions of resilience, and you will see its evolution. So here, 2001, it was defined as the capacity to bounce back and to use physical and economic resources effectively to aid recovery following exposures and hazards. Now, I'm giving you a tip. Please have a look at those words that I have underlined in red and green, because we'll go back to that. But for emphasis, I made a different set of colors because you will notice that those red ones are characteristics of resilience, while the green ones are those we need to undertake to achieve resilience. So it's a capacity to bounce back. That's a characteristic. Using resources effectively to aid in recovery. So recovery is an undertaking. So moving on. Resilience is a sustainable network of physical systems and human communities capable of managing extreme events. So it's a characteristic, sustainable network, and it's all about managing extreme events. So again, remember those red and green because we will go back to them later on. Resilience is the ability of social status, organizations, communities to mitigate hazards, contain the effects of disasters, and carry out recovery activities. And at the same time, looking into the future, mitigating the effects of future disasters. That was in 2007 as defined. In the same year, it was defined, this time social resilience is the capacity of social groups and communities to bounce back. Again, bounce back was repeated. Or respond positively to disasters or adversity. Again, respond was mentioned. So respond positively because when disaster happens, we all respond. but are we responding positively? So that's where the resilience was defined. Another definition of resilience is the ability, again, ability of a social system to respond and recover from disasters, and includes those inherent conditions that allow system to absorb impacts and cope with an event. And the one we're using right now, the most recent, is the UNDRR definition of resilience. So it is the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards, take note of the red, to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through preservation or restoration of its essential basic structures and functions through risk management. But I would like to highlight here the word transform. Transform means to change. Therefore, resilience also looks into building back better. It's all about changing for the better. So that's also basically what resilience is. It's not just about bouncing back, but in a better situation. So we did several researches. There were studies. A colleague of mine, we went to a place in Thailand. It's a community, it's a local community where it's a good demonstration of resilience, where while they were the victim of tsunami, they were the tsunami capital of Thailand that time, but after the disaster, they were better off than they were before the disaster. So that was a good example of resilience. So we have defined what disaster is. We have defined what resilience is. So resilience, looking at the figure now, is if there's a stress or a shock, in this case, a cyclone, flooding, okay, what happens is you collapse. Those are the negative ones, responding negatively. Resilience is moving up or even doing better. But you have to consider there the element of time. The shorter you achieve resilience, the better. So to summarize resilience, I'm showing you 4 pictures here. Can you recall some of those words or phrases that were underlined in red? The most common is reflected there in those pictures. So first, resilience is the ability of a system, a community, a local community, because we're talking here of local disaster resilience. A community, a local community to resist, absorb, bounce back, okay, from disasters or from shocks. How? Through learning and adaptation. So that's learning and adaptation. So let me repeat. Resilience is the ability to resist, absorb, bounce back through learning and adaptation. So for this part of the objectives, which is definition of terms, now let's look back. So what is again a disaster? The only key word you have to remember here is that disaster is an event that has occurred and resulted to impacts and losses where the community cannot cope using its resources. Okay, so it's an issue of capacity. Next is disaster risk. Disaster risk are potential losses, okay, that one may incur over a future period of time. And often, it is translated into dollars or won. And disaster risk or potential losses is a factor of hazard. What is a hazard? Hazard is an event that may happen, and if it does, may bring damage and losses. So we've shown you some examples of hazards. What are those? Geophysical, climatological, technological, hydrometeorological. Again, exposure. Exposure is the what. No? What could be damaged as a result of disasters. So that's what you call exposure. Vulnerability is the why. These are the conditions that make a community or a system or an asset prone or susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. And capacity are the resources, what a community has, which it can use to achieve its goals, to address to reduce disaster losses. And lastly, resilience. This is about the ability to absorb, resist, bounce back from disasters through learning and adaptation. So in ending, resilience is a means, is a condition we want to achieve, not an activity that we would like to undertake. Because in the third session, we'll be discussing what are the things we need to undertake to achieve disaster resilience. So, we have covered important terms in disaster resilience. So, it's just 7 terms, easy for you to recall. I have provided you with the formula or the relationships, so that'll be quite easier for you to recall or even digest the terms. The second will be covering the importance of disaster resilience. Why do we need to undertake disaster resilience? And by the way, resilience is oftentimes used now. It's a byword, disaster resilience. So why do we need to undertake such? So instead of explaining to you why, I'll just present to you some figures, some statistics for you to realize that, I think we really need to achieve or undertake disaster resilience because it's important. So first, disasters exacerbate existing inequalities. Take a look at the figure that I'm showing you. While this is a figure in Pakistan, it generally applies to almost all countries because there are inequalities. So when disaster happen or when disasters strike, the most affected are the poor. Okay? $1 in asset losses, take note, $1 in asset losses results in larger well-being losses for the poor. What am I trying to say here? For a poor community, for a poor individual or poor family, $1 is a lot. Now, for us, or maybe for you, how much does a Starbucks cost? A Starbucks coffee? $2, $3, $4. But that's only for one coffee. But for the poor, they don't have that luxury, and that $1, if it's an asset, and if it gets damaged or lost as a result of disaster, they will really feel that $1 loss. Okay? Again, interesting figures. Have a look. From 2008 to 2017, there are 348 disaster occurrences, while in 2018 alone, there's 315. So what are we trying to say here? Because of climate change, because of anthropogenic activities, let's expect more occurrences, no? To happen. Disaster occurrences, events such as floods. So if you will look at it, in 2018 alone, 127 occurrences of floods, while 2008 to 2017, that's 153. So it's a big possibility that in the coming years, we'll be experiencing more floods. Now, if you will look at the 10 countries or continents where number of disasters happening, let me move a bit. Look at Asia, where Korea also is. 141 disasters happening. In my country, the Philippines, that's 10. Okay? Korea may not be there yet, or good that it's not there, but we're simply saying that in our region, we're a shopping mall of disasters, but at the same time, we're a shopping mall as well of good practices in responding to disasters. Again, if you will look at the figure, climate, seismic, but if you will look at climatological hazards or occurrences, it continues to move up. So, as a result of climate change, then as I earlier said, there will be more hydrometeorological events that may occur. And we need to respond to this. And we need to prepare for this. That's why resilience, disaster resilience, is very important. But because of our efforts, because of efforts of countries to achieve disaster resilience, look at the graph here for Bangladesh. Bangladesh in South Asia is a natural catch basin because bordering countries would it's a natural catch basin of rivers. Plus, at the same time, they're prone to these storms. So they experience massive floodings. But if you will look at the figure, from deaths to 300,000, that's a lot, to 100,000, to 4,000, it continues to go down. And that is an example of trying to achieve disaster resilience. So that's how important disaster resilience is. Another figure is in China, in Hong Kong, 2 years back, there's a storm. But again, look, the source. Deaths due to typhoons in Hong Kong, China, 1970s to 2000. It's dropping. Why? Because of effective early warning system or because of people responding to early warning system. So this is again a demonstration of why we need to undertake disaster resilience. In terms of economic losses, we will see here that when a disaster happens, so much resources are lost. So if we prepare or respond accordingly to disaster, then those losses can be lessened. See, again, we're trying to emphasize here, I'm showing you the figure that what will happen if we won't work to achieve disaster resilience. And the last slide here is number of people lifted out of extreme poverty in the Asia-Pacific region between 1990 and 2013. So it shows here that when we work towards achieving disaster resilience, we are in reality lifting people out of poverty. So that's how important disaster resilience is. That's how important resilience has to be realized. That's why there are activities, efforts that must be done to achieve resilience. Now, the meat of the session is on the how. Now we have discussed the what, we discussed the why, and now we will be discussing the how. But I think it's too much so far for you to have to digest everything. So we'll pause for a couple of minutes, reflect on what we have covered, and see how we can use that when we discuss later the how of disaster resilience. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll go back again to you in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, so welcome back to our session. So I hope you had the time to reflect on the first two objectives that we have discussed. Now, we go to the third part. We'll be discussing ways and processes of achieving disaster resilience. Now, earlier in the first two parts of our session, I remember I asked you to recall what were some of the green underlined words and phrases that I flashed when we discussed the definition of resilience. Okay, start recalling. Can you remember a few? I'll just give you a few minutes to reflect whatever you can recall. Okay, so I think I'm pretty much certain that you have at least recalled a few. So as I've said, those green words or phrases are in reality activities being undertaken to achieve resilience. So let's just put that in a proper context. So when we're talking of disaster resilience, the processes, what are the things we need to do or we need to undertake? As I've earlier said, disaster resilience is not an activity that you undertake. It is a condition you want to achieve. So if you want to achieve that condition, there are processes or activities that need to be done. And these are those. No? So first, disaster management. You've probably heard disaster management. You probably even heard disaster risk reduction or DRR. Or maybe you even probably heard disaster risk management. So what's the difference? Some are using disaster management interchangeably. Some are using disaster risk reduction. Some are using disaster risk management. So what is it? So what we'll do is we'll try to see the relationships and in reality link that to disaster resilience because these are the processes or the activities you need to undertake. So as we said, disaster management. What is disaster management? So basically, it focuses on an event. Let's say flood. So when flood happens, when flood is there, when the event is there, you can only do two things. The first thing is you can respond. So there's a response operation. So what is a response? Response are actions taken directly before, during, or immediately after the disaster in order to save lives, no? And then improve situations. So basically, when we're talking of response, it is something that has to be done quickly, all right? So most of the time, there's a problem there because of the lack of preparedness for response. No? Many times, communities became shocked or surprised that when the event is there, they cannot respond positively. Remember in our definition of resilience earlier, there's a term there that mentioned ability to respond positively in an event. So, response operations and recovery activities. So when flood happen, you can just simply respond and later on recovery. Now, let me go back. Why are there two overlapping circles? Simply because some are saying that response is part of recovery activities. In fact, response is the start of early recovery. That's why they tend to overlap. But the only difference here is that response operations has to be done quickly, swiftly, effectively, because its purpose is to save lives. Okay? Improve well-being of people in a disaster. Okay, so what is recovery? Recovery is the restoring or improving of livelihoods, health, economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets, systems, activities of a disaster-affected community or society. Aligning it with the principles of sustainable development, which we'll discuss later, and the Build Back Better to avoid or reduce future disaster risk. Now, I've mentioned building back better because, as I've said in our discussion earlier of disaster resilience, resilience also is not just going back to the pre-disaster situation. Because if the pre-disaster situation is bad, then you're just going back to that same situation. So resilience is also becoming better than the pre-disaster situation. And it pretty much provides the link in this context of building back better. So moving on. So disaster management, let me repeat, talks about events. And when events occur, be it earthquake, cold spell, drought, flood, sinking of a ferry, you can only do two things: respond and recover. Okay? When the flood is there, can you still prepare? Not anymore. When the flood is there, you can just respond and you can recover. But the quality of your response is very much determined by the quality of your preparedness. So, let's continue. On the other side, so you can see the difference. Earlier is disaster management. Now we're talking of DRR, or disaster risk reduction. DRR is an everyday thing. No? You do it daily, not only when the event happens. Even before the event happens, during, after. Okay? So, when you're talking of DRR, it basically involves three things. Preparedness, you can look at the figure there. Preparedness, prevention, and mitigation. Right? So we'll go through each of those. So when you're talking of DRR, we've mentioned prevention. What is prevention? Prevention are activities and measures to avoid existing and new disaster risk. Remember again, what's our definition of disaster risks? Those are losses as a result of disaster. So activities and measures to avoid existing and new disaster risk or losses. And another definition is, it is the outright avoidance of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. Okay? And another is mitigation. Take note that if you cannot prevent the adverse impact, say for example, if you cannot prevent floods from inundating a farm, a 100-hectare farm, then the best way is to mitigate the impact. Meaning, instead of 100 hectares of farm being inundated, then lessening the impact, it will be good if we can reduce it to 60 to 40, because there are times that you cannot prevent, but you can mitigate. So mitigating or disaster mitigation is the lessening or limiting of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. So if you will look at the photo that I chose, it's a way of lessening the impact of floods. No? So take note, prevention is the outright avoidance of the impact. But if you cannot prevent it from happening, then at least let's lessen or let's mitigate those impacts. And the last part is what you call preparedness. Now, you will see why there's a overlapping of circle again with disaster risk reduction and with disaster management. This is because you've probably heard the word preparedness for response and recovery. It means that before a disaster happens, before a flood happens, you have to be already prepared for response. Meaning, you know where the people, there's a place for evacuating people. There are already stocks or food prepositioned. There are already people who will be responsible for taking care of the food, of shelter, of health, and all other stuff. These are part of the preparedness for response. And part also of preparedness is doing a recovery plan. How do you build back better? So that's why there's the overlap there of two circles. There's a thing called preparedness for response and recovery. So what's preparedness? It is the knowledge and capacities developed to effectively, take note of the red one, to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of likely, imminent, or current hazard events or conditions. Now let me repeat here. Effectively anticipate. Anticipate means before. Respond to means during. And recover from means after. So preparedness looks into the before, the during, and the after of an event. All right, so again, very critical in the part of preparedness, if you will see there in the picture, is, I think it's an antenna or a transmitter, but I want to emphasize here that part of preparedness, very important, and I think this will be discussed in the next module, is the early warning system. Okay, so that will be covered, I think, when you're talking of the local disaster resilience framework, and its part, and early warning system plays a very critical part. So in essence, we have already disaster management, we already have disaster risk reduction. Now, there's a bigger circle that covers both. And this bigger circle is what we call disaster risk management, or DRM. So what is DRM? DRM is the systematic process of using administrative directives, organizations, and operational skills and capacities. So the red ones are the inputs, are the imperatives, are the things necessary for you to undertake the green, for us to implement strategies, policies, and improved coping capacities in order to lessen the adverse impacts of hazards and the possibility of disaster. Now, I chose a very interesting picture here, just to emphasize to you the bigger circle of disaster risk management, which covers disaster management and disaster risk reduction. So, look at this picture. So I thought that, what shall I do to prevent those things, to prevent that from falling and crushing the heads of this couple. So I thought that, maybe I should put more ropes. Will it prevent those stuff from collapsing and crushing the head of the family? Maybe no. Maybe it will still, crush the heads of this couple. So I thought that, what if I put helmet on? Will it address the issue? Maybe not again. So it's very important there on the third part to follow policies. What are the policies in place? And in most cases, there are good policies, even local policies in place. But the challenge is how these policies are enforced. Okay? So, disaster resilience is basically undertaking disaster risk management. Undertaking disaster risk management facilitates sustainable development and resilience. Okay? So I hope it pretty much gave you a better understanding of disaster resilience. Disaster resilience or resilience is about building capacities. Okay? Capacity to undertake prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. Okay? So with that, I end the three objectives of this module. So let's have a quick recap. So, were we able to review the important terms in disaster resilience? Can you recall those 7 important terms? So, those 7 are basically disaster, disaster risk, the components of disaster risk, or the formula for disaster risk, which is hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and capacity. And the 7th term we discuss is resilience. So I hope it's pretty much clear to you conceptually. Now, the second objective was, we'll discuss the importance of resilience. So I hope you'll see that from the figures that I have shown you, I hope you were able to appreciate that disaster resilience is an important thing we have to realize. Why? Because looking at the figures, occurrence of hydrometeorological and climatological events would most likely continue to increase. Because of climate change, there will be greater occurrences with even stronger magnitude of these events. So, because disasters set back development and inequality and poverty is exacerbated, then the more that we need to pursue disaster resilience. So that's the why. And the last part is, what are the ways and processes for achieving disaster resilience? So what I've shown you are the different relationships. So we're saying that for us to realize or achieve disaster resilience, it's all about building capacities. Again, capacity is the opposite of vulnerability. Remember, as we've earlier defined, if you want to reduce vulnerability, let's increase the capacity. And increasing capacities is part of building resilience. So it's about building capacities in the aspect of preparedness, mitigation, prevention, recovery, and response. So in essence, disaster risk management, and disaster risk management facilitates sustainable development. So that will give you time for reflection. So thank you very much. I hope you learned something from our session. And as I've said earlier in the first part, you have my email. Feel free to send your questions, reflect on it, and then on the fourth or last day of the training, I think there will be a question and answer. And I hope to be able to provide some answers to those questions. So thank you very much and have a fruitful learning.